Did
That was
Ellsberg have any lesson or advice or theme to what his comments were about the dangers whistleblowers or leakers, as the government likes to call them, face today?
Yes, Judge. Dan has for a long time emphasized this message, and I quote, "Don't do what I did."
Mm.
And what Dan says next, of course, is, "I waited too long." Saw in 1964 that the Vietnam escapade was based on a bunch of lies and was going to get a lot of people killed. I waited it until, well, he says 1971 for the Pentagon Papers, but he also wrote in this not so well known book, Secrets, that his first leak came in 1968 and prevented a widening of the war, his leak and one other, up to the Chinese border. And those of us who are around for Korea remember what happens when you go right up to the Chinese border, all right? So what was that all about? Well, that appeared in the citation with the award that we, Sam Adams Associates for Integrity, gave to Dan Ellsberg on the 11th of April at a private ceremony, Dan's health situation being what it is, up there in the Berkeley Hills. And what Dan said in his own remarks, it was only a half hour or so ceremony. The video comes down to 22 minutes. He said at the end, still very, very sharp, and you could tell it. He said, "Don't forget to say this. Don't forget to say this, Dan." He says, "Look, my message continues to be, don't do what I did. Don't wait until the bombs start falling. Don't wait until a lot of people get killed. Don't wait until the war gets widened up to the Chinese border."
Oh, the
Sound
great
familiar?
man who changed the First Amendment legal landscape of the United States, and who exposed the government's deception almost like never before, is humble enough to say, "I waited too long. I should have done it earlier. If you're in a situation like I was, do it before the killing starts, not after it goes on." Fair summary?
Correct. And I just add that, well, Dan and I and Ann Wright and a few others created what we call the Truth Telling Coalition. This was back in 2004, okay? And we rallied the ACLU and lots of other folks saying, look, we can protect whistleblowers if they only come forward. Little do we know that just 6 years later, Julian Assange would have found a very clever, sophisticated way to get the truth up and out and into people's computers. So the whole world changed with Julian Assange. He too was an awardee of the Sam Adams Prize. And what Dan said was very moving. He says, "I'm glad to be put in the company of the previous 21 Sam Adams Award winners."
Now, the neocons, of course, think that Julian Assange and Dan Ellsberg are monsters who should either be executed or locked up for the rest of our lives. What brought about the rise of these neocons, and how can they, if ever, be dislodged from power? Even Trump had neocons working for him. I mean, John Bolton, as an example.
Yeah, the truth is the best disinfectant, as you know, Judge. That's why I relish being on this program with you. We're really in quite a fix right now.
Yes, we are.
There are a couple of folks being brought to trial for weaponizing the First Amendment. Now, think back to 71, 72, when Ellsberg forced, and a gutsy guy in the New York Times said, look, go ahead, do it, publish these things and see what happens. Now, the Supreme Court came down on the right side of that, as you say. Now we have, instead of protecting the First Amendment, people are being tried for weaponizing the First Amendment. In other words, saying things that the government doesn't want you to say. That's a hell of a fix, Judge. It's only we that have the opportunity, and really, I would say the requirement, to make sure our fellow citizens know how dangerous the situation is.
Well, the situation is very dangerous because that attitude, Julian Assange should be published for what he revealed, even though he fits directly within the four corners, if you will, of the Pentagon Papers decision. A media outlet in possession of information about the government, which is of material interest to the public. Isn't it of material interest to the public that the government was engaged in war crimes and the perpetrators of the war crimes were laughing about it? If you actually watch the tapes that Julian Assange ran, the government will say, well, Assange talked to Bradley Manning about how to get this information to him. Well, Ellsberg must have talked to somebody at the New York Post and at the New York Times. They didn't just drop it off on West 43rd Street. He had to know where to go and how to give it to them. This is all an assault on the First Amendment. You're right, and it's very dangerous. The First Amendment, school children know what it says. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In the midst of the oral argument of the Pentagon Papers case, the great Justice William O. Douglas looks at the lawyer for the government and says, well, let me ask you this. Does no law really mean no law? And of course, he couldn't answer. How do we know that happened during the oral argument? Because the Supreme Court did something it has never done before or since. It put in the middle of the opinion that portion of the oral argument, the Q&A between Justice Douglas and this government lawyer, and how befuddled he was and how he couldn't answer Justice Douglas's question, does no law really mean no law? It obviously doesn't mean no law. It doesn't mean what it says in the minds of government prosecutors if they can prosecute you for speaking. I mean, this takes us to Teixeira. Let's say Teixeira did, the Massachusetts National Guardsman, now in jail in Boston. Let's say he did what the government says he did. He published matters of material interest to the public. The government has been killing people and lying to you about it, and the government itself believes it's a futile cause. The Ukrainians are going to lose. That's the takeaway from these documents. Why isn't he protected? Why should he have to work for the New York Times or the Washington Post? He published them on his own. This is an era of self-publishing. I would argue the Pentagon Papers protections should extend to him. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the leak could have a salutary effect. As you say, it pumped some truth up into the air, and we're likely to see within the next few weeks whether the fact that the Washington Post and the BBC, and to an extent the New York Times, jumped on this story for that first crucial week and said, no, Ukraine can't win. No, Russia is not running out of ammunition. The West is running out of ammunition. Oh, no, there's not going to be any talks because this will slough on into next year. That's all up and out there now. And to the degree that the media, the mainstream media, is now dealing with this, or will have to, in just a couple of weeks when this counteroffensive peters out, when everybody's putting their money on the Ukrainian counteroffensive, it's not going to go anywhere. So what then? Now, the real fly in the ointment here, in my opinion, Judge, is the topic that Jacob Siegel addresses in his latest piece in the Tablet. It's how the propaganda organs of our government are joined with the mainstream media and the deep state, and I use that term advisedly, to deprive the American people from knowing what the truth is, okay? It's an amazing reconstruction of Russiagate and all the errors and all that has come out with the fact that Twitter had FBI people in it to make sure we didn't know what we should have known with respect to Hunter Biden's laptop, for example. So we've come to the crucible now. When it turns out that the American people have been misled into thinking the Ukrainians could win. I mean, even Obama said, Ukraine is not a core interest for us. It's a core interest for Russia. We ought to really be careful what we risk getting involved in a war about. Well, wasn't Biden vice president then? I think he was. What happened? Well, you have Tony Blinken and all these guys. Blinken, I think, is about to be thrown under the bus. Certainly, he's going to have to be thrown under the bus when all his assurances, no, Ukraine can win, NATO can win, when they go bust. And that's going to happen within the next month. Mark my words.
The Poles are once again dreaming of restoring the interstate union with Ukraine and revival of the underdone empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, from sea to sea. Having no intellectual power for creating a viable image of the future and living up to its reputation as a country toppled over into the past, Poland is drawing inspiration from 400-year-old maps when parts of today's Ukraine still belong to it. Imperial hallucinations are pushing the Polish society into the abyss of severe historical breakage. Warsaw elites can't wait to see themselves taking geopolitical revenge on Russia, including reconstructing the Pereslav, you'll have to tell me what that is, agreement. Emboldened by the current circumstances, Poland has decided that the chance to absorb the remnants of Ukraine is to be taken now or never. Wow. Didn't he also say about a month ago that if the Russian troops needed to, they would go all the way to the Polish-Ukraine border?
He did, yeah. Okay, so here's the Russian bear speaking.
His last name is the symbol of Russian society, the bear.
And he's drawing on Russian history. Now, Americans don't necessarily know that as we were coming out of the Dark Ages, the Russians fought for 2 centuries under the rule of the Mongols, Genghis Khan and his Golden Horde. When they finally got out from under that, they were attacked by the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Hanseatic League, and they had to fend those off for another century. Okay, we're talking 16th century, 17th century now. Every Russian school boy or girl knows that history. And so it's speaking to these people saying, look, the Poles are at it again, and the Lithuanians, and of course, the proof is in the pudding. The Poles and the Lithuanians are at it again. They're egging on the rest of NATO, dragging France and Germany by the watts to become more aggressive. And the Russians have to contend with that, but appealing to Russian history is a real good way to sensitize the Russian population. Look, this happened before. This is recidivism. This is recidivist imperialism. Watch out.
And I've said this before, I'll say it again. And still, Joe Biden and the American government has no off-ramp here.
Yeah, the only off-ramp would be a very distasteful one. If I were advising them, I would say, look, now's the time to deal. You have the Vatican you could go to for good offices. You have China, you have Brazil, you have Lukashenko, and they're all calling for a ceasefire and negotiation. What the hell? I mean, the first thing you do is you stop the bleeding, right?
Right.
My God, don't you have a conscience? You stop the bleeding. And then you get around the table and you figure out what the best deal you can do. You give and take, okay? That's not happening. And that's because of these adolescents that are really not advising. They're running their show there together with Victoria Nuland. That's dangerous. And the only hopeful thing I see in all these revelations is that there seems to be opposition to that now. And the truth will make us free. The truth could end this thing once Americans are educated to the fact that we were lied to, that Ukraine could win. We were lied to that World War III could be avoided and we could win and the Russians lose. I mean, it can't be avoided. Biden can't have both. He can't win in Ukraine, defeat Russia, and avoid World War III.
Brilliantly put, Ray. Thank you so much for joining us. I can tell from all the commenters you are wildly popular and very much approved by this audience and certainly by this host. Thank you, my dear friend.
Well, thank you, Judge.